Are familiar with the show CSI? Everybody like that? Okay, so today we're not going to do exactly a criminal scene investigation, but we're going to do something similar. It's a historic house investigation. Now this is a different type of history than you're probably used to, but I have to say it's much more fun than most kinds of history that you've probably encountered so far. And so what we're going to do is use Adina, and you've just come from there, right? Okay. I've done this. Half of the group's going to have seen the house before they come here and half haven't. Yeah. So, right, I'm going to run through this very quickly. This is really for the people who haven't been there so they know what we're talking about. So we're going to do a historic house investigation, kind of like you would do a crime scene investigation. We're going to put the house under a microscope, and we're going to see what kind of evidence, physical evidence and documentary evidence, we can find about the house. So real quickly, you know who Thomas and Eleanor Worthington are. Thomas was an important surveyor. He was a colonel in the militia. He was a justice of the peace. He was a farmer and had tenant farmers. He was a businessman. He became Ohio's first U.S. senator, and he was also Ohio's 6th governor. Now I'm going to give you the 30-second history of the house so you know approximately what time frame we're in and what we're talking about. Thomas and his wife Eleanor came from Virginia to what was then the Northwest Territory, because remember, Ohio didn't become a state until 1803. They came here in 1799. Thomas Worthington was an ambitious man with big ideas, and he felt that in Virginia there wasn't enough place for him because there was already an established gentry. And so he was a moderately wealthy man who came to the Northwest Territory so he could make his mark in a new territory. He became known as the father of Ohio statehood. You probably knew that, right? Yes, because he was the one who pushed most for Ohio to become a state, which it did in 1803. Okay, we've got 10 seconds left. The Adina Mansion was built in 1807, which was just 4 years after Ohio became a state. It certainly is not typical of early frontier housing. Most people lived in log structures that were fairly primitive and only had a few rooms. Adina has 18 rooms. It's a large block, it's a large mansion with 2 wings on the sides, and Thomas built it to make a statement about his wealth and status and also the kind of impact that he intended to make. Now obviously we don't have a photograph from 1807, so we had to use a description that was done. Someone described Adina in 1807 as this: it's an elegant seat, and it will be one of the best and most tasty houses not only of this state but west of the Alleghenies. So does anybody have an idea what tasty means? In that, pleasing to the eye. Exactly. It's in good taste. Very good. So this is the earliest known image of Adina, which was drawn in 1846 by a historian known as Henry Howe. So again, this obviously isn't a photograph, but this is the earliest image that we have. The Worthington family lived there from 1807 until the last Worthington died in, well, not the last Worthington, the Worthington who lived in the house died in 1899, and this is a photo of Adina in 1900. So people had lived there for 75 years continuously in the Worthington family. But by that time, they had lost some of their money, and the house started to fall into disrepair. So it sat vacant between 1900 and 1903, when the Smith family of Chillicothe bought the house. He was a wealthy Chillicothe attorney, and they bought the house and they made major renovations to the house. They moved walls to create different rooms. They installed plumbing. They installed electricity. So the house after 1903 was an extremely different place than it had been. Now, they lived there, as you see at the bottom, until 1946, and then Mr. and Mrs. Smith had died. So her daughter decided to give the house to the state of Ohio. Well, the state of Ohio gave it to the Ohio Historical Society, which is who I work for. And in 1947, they realized that the sesquicentennial was coming up in 1953. That's 150 years. So they decided to restore the house. Because Thomas Worthington had played such an important role as the father of statehood, they saw Adina as the perfect symbol for the centerpiece of the celebration. So Adina became a symbol of the sesquicentennial in 1953, and they restored the house. Now what that means is you bring about an old appearance using new materials. So whenever we talk about a restoration, we're talking about restoring an old appearance with new materials. Now we're going to fast forward 50 years till 1997. Ironically, this bicentennial is going to be coming up in 2003. So my task in 1997 was to begin an investigation for a re-restoration of the house for 2003. And again, it's to honor Thomas Worthington's contribution as the father of Ohio statehood and to make Adena look like it did in 1807. Now remember, the house had gone through 100 years of the family living there, almost 50 years of the Smiths living there, and then it was supposedly restored to what it looked like. So it's gone through massive changes in 200 years. So my task in 1997 is to take a look at the house and see what we know. Now, we knew a lot about their possessions, for example. These are just a few of the pieces that we know to have belonged to the family and that were returned either by purchase or by donation. This is a bureau that was made on site when Adena was being constructed. This is an elegant card table in what's known as the Federal style. There's a pair of those, but you can see that they're very simple yet very elegant. This is their dining room table from the dining room, and this is one of many pieces. There's two ends like this, and then there's many leaves in between. But again, you can see it's a very classic, simple yet elegant style. This is another piece that we acquired from the family. It's a mahogany sideboard. You probably saw this in the dining room. Again, there were two of those, and one's a reconstruction because only one was returned to us. The family kept one. So one's original and one's a reconstruction. But you can again see it's known as the Hepplewhite style. Very simple, very elegant. So we know about their furnishings, we know where they would go in the house, but now we want to know more about the house itself. So here's where our, well, it's not a crime scene, it's a historic house investigation begins. Two of the things that stood out from the 1953 restoration as the most unusual to what we now know about restoration techniques and what things would have looked like in the early 19th century. Not that they were wrong, they just had less information and less scientific techniques than we now have today. And so they were under the impression, which came from colonial Williamsburg, that early 19th century colors were very muted. They were pastels, like light pinks, light blues, a lot of grays, and light greens. Well, over the years, through scientific investigations, we've learned that that is not true, that in fact the colors were extremely vivid. And think of it in a world where there's no TV, there's no magazines, there's no photographs. Color in fabrics, floor coverings, and paints and wallpapers were extremely important because it was the only type of imagery that they really had. So the first room we decided to look at was Thomas Worthington's library. Now you think about a library, what do you do there? You know, he was a surveyor, he drew his maps there, he wrote his field notes. He was a farmer. He kept track of all of his farm accounts with his tenants. He was a businessman who kept extensive business records. He was a politician who probably wrote a dozen letters every day. And it was also a place where his children had their lessons with their tutors. And it was also a place where the family prayed, so they'd be reading from the Bible with the family and servants. Okay, take a good look at this. This is what the library looked like when they restored it in 1953. Now, going back to this, if you were doing a room and all these activities, what do you think's wrong with this room? Excuse me? Not enough light. Exactly. So that was our first clue. When we walked into this room to begin the investigation for 2003, we thought, now this is a library where a man is writing with no artificial light, probably just a candle or perhaps some sort of small lantern. This was a bright sunny day, so imagine what it would be like in the winter. It would be impossible. So something just didn't ring true about the room.